All right, well, it looks like we have about 2 more videos to go before we wrap everything up with John Dewey's, you know, pretty influential work in at least in the philosophy of art. His book, long book, the title of it is Art as Experience, and we're going to primarily be covering chapter 12 in this video. The title of the chapter is The Challenge to Philosophy. And if we have time, we might even jump forward and jump ahead to the final chapter. We're going to skip ahead to chapter 14. The title of that one is Art and Civilization. And I don't know if we'll have time. We might have time to at least get to the first couple slides on that one, but we'll probably have to save the most of it for the final concluding lecture on John Dewey. So without further ado, let's jump into this one. Again, chapter 12, The Challenge to Philosophy. Let's see what Dewey has to say. Aesthetic experience is imaginative. This fact, in connection with a false idea of the nature of imagination, has obscured the larger fact that all conscious experience has of necessity some degree of imaginative quality. So this is another mistake of theorists, not necessarily theorists of art for Dewey, but for theory in general. Okay, they have this false idea of what an imagination is, and don't realize that it's such an essential part of experience in general. Okay, so that's the first point he makes here. For while the roots of every experience are found in the interaction of a live creature with its environment, that experience becomes conscious, a matter of perception, only when meanings enter it that are derived from prior experiences. Imagination is the only gateway through which these meanings can find their way into a present interaction. Or rather, as we've just seen, the conscious adjustment of the new and the old is imagination. Okay, so imagination, he's making this point, it serves this vital function in the living creature, right? We've talked about the living creature enough, I think, in previous videos, but this encounter of the living creature with his environment. Dewey is saying here, what gives the objects of my environment meaning is strictly wrought through this instrument of the imagination. So the fact that I know that I need to avoid fire is because I've had previous experiences of things that look similar to that bright, flashy thing over there that's moving closer towards me and might engulf me. Okay, so this particular experience of fire is different from the one in the past. I'm using my imagination. It's a visual sort of picturing of past incidences, and so this is the birth of consciousness, right? Of being conscious for Dewey. So again, the imagination is a conscious adjustment of new and old. And what is mind for him, right? He gives a definition of mind to his credit, right? A lot of philosophers, they speak of mind and they just sort of take it for granted. I feel like psychologists do this a lot. They talk about the psyche, the mind, and you can't find, go look at a psychology textbook, try to find a definition of mind. You're not going to find it. Good luck. But, to his credit, you might not agree with this definition, but here's how he sees mind. So mind, that is the body of organized meanings by means of which events of the present have significance for us, does not always enter into the activities and undergoings that are going on here and now. So in other words, we don't always have a mind. That sounds kind of crazy, but this is also a bit Heideggerian. I keep mentioning Heidegger in these Dewey lectures, Heidegger and Nietzsche. These are two parallels I really don't think Dewey would have liked, but nevertheless, sorry, guy. Sorry, Mr. Professor Dewey. But it's true. I think Heidegger's saying something much very similar in some of his early writings, particularly, his famous Sein und Zeit, being in time. Well, Heidegger, I think he's making a similar point that when we're in the flow of things, when we're sort of just walking around, sort of going about our day, we're not always consciously aware. It's not when I'm driving in my car, I'm not thinking I'm driving in my car. I'm turning the steering wheel. I'm about to shift gears. I'm about to put my, I just do it, right? I'm just sort of kind of on autopilot, you might say. But sometimes this mind is baffled and arrested, this sort of stream of flow, sorry, is baffled and arrested. Then the stream of meanings aroused into activity by the present contact remain aloof. Then it forms the matter of reverie, of dream. Ideas are floating, not anchored in any existence as its property, its possession of meanings, right? So he's talking about an experience of sort of, of disorganization, right? Of, inability to cope and organize our interactions with the environing world. Then it forms a matter of reverie, dream, ideas are floating. Emotions are equally loose and floating. Emotions that are equally loose and floating cling to these ideas. The pleasure they afford is the reason why they are entertained and are allowed to occupy this scene. They are attached to existence only in a way that, as long as sanity abides, is felt to be only fanciful and unreal. So again, this is a very obscure passage, but again, what he's saying is that there's this sort of free flow of activity. It's only when there's this disruption, when we sort of have to sort of step back and circumspectfully try to find a meaning and try to attach a meaning to something, okay? And so how does this apply to art? How does mind, activity, sort of the normal stream and flow of our experience, how does this apply to aesthetics and aesthetic experience? Well, he writes, in every work of art, however, these meanings are actually embodied in the material, which thereby becomes the medium for their expression. This fact constitutes the peculiarity of all experience that is definitively aesthetic. Its imaginative quality dominates because meanings and values that are wider and deeper than the particular here and now in which they are anchored are realized by way of expressions. And we should know what he means by expressions by now. What does Dewey mean by artistic expression? Okay, so let me start that sentence over again. Its imaginative quality dominates in a work of art. Its imaginative quality dominates because meanings and values that are wider and deeper than the particular here and now in which they're anchored are realized by way of expressions, although not by way of an object that is physically efficacious in relation to other objects. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, we've got this painting of Rene Magritte here on the left, right? C'est pas un pipe, right? This is not a pipe, is what the caption says, right? It isn't a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe, right? Magritte was fond of doing this, of messing with language, messing with meaning. His paintings, a lot of them are really plain, but here we have a pipe that is taken out of its physically efficacious relation to other objects, a fancy way of Dewey saying this, right? So this is not a physical pipe that is a part of a world of things, a world of objects that all have reference to each other, right? The pipe is used to smoke tobacco, right? So it's a part of this relation to another thing, tobacco, and the smoking that ensues if I smoke tobacco out of a pipe involves an agent, me, right? So there's this sort of relationship of myself to all these objects that is functional, and as he puts it, physically efficacious, okay? But when I see this painting, this image of the pipe, it's not a part of that totality of objects. It's not a part of that system of instrumentality. I hate to use that word because that's sort of a Heideggerian term. That's sort of what Heidegger would say. But again, there's a lot of parallels here, I think, with Heidegger, right? So there's no functionality of this painting, right? However, right, this painting, what it does do, because it's removed from that stream of, what you might call functionality, and I guess, since John Dewey is a pragmatist, right, it's no longer pragmatic. I'm not going to use it for some specific purpose. Its imaginative quality dominates. That's what I focus on. I focus on how it affects my imagination. This again is like Kant. I keep bringing up Kant in certain regards. He and Dewey would be on the same page as far as the ability of works of art to what is the word, to spark some sort of free play is the word that Kant uses, the free play of the imagination. But it's sort of, it gets our imagination going, right? So when we look at works of art, and so the meanings and values are wider and deeper than the particular here and now. So it's not just the painting I'm looking at here and now in the art gallery. If I'm looking at Rene Magritte's painting, if it's a good work of art and it's expressive of something deeper, I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of the day, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess it isn't a pipe. And, how does language work? How is it that language refers to things? Because obviously this is a representation of a thing. But I can get into all this metaphysical speculation based on this one experience of this work of art, right? And that's not that's not a function of its use for me, or as he puts it, it's physically efficacious relation to other objects. It's useful to smoke tobacco out of. No, it's a painting of something that's useful to smoke tobacco out of. So the work of art, he says, however, unlike the machine, is not only the outcome of imagination. You might say the machine is this, in a similar sense, a product of our imagination, right? In nature, if we are using our imagination to, as he puts it, let me back up here, right? Our imagination is sort of this this tool that we use for a conscious adjustment of the new and the old, right? That's the imagination. So it has this basic primal function in experience. Right. So if that's true, then, if dealing with the environment involves creating tools, technological advances, machines, right, things like mechanisms, these also would be a function or an outcome of the imagination. But in a work of art, it's a little different, right? Unlike the machine, it's not only an outcome of the imagination, but it operates imaginatively. Right? So it makes our imagination, it sparks our imagination. So it operates imaginatively rather than in the realm of physical existences, right? So it's not, as he puts it, efficacious in relation to other objects, right? It's not a part of that workshop. It's not one tool amongst many others that refer to other tools. It's not a part of a whole system. It is sort of its own expression of what it's expressing. I seem kind of a very vague way of putting it, right? Let's continue here. So back to the machine, okay, that's different from the work of art, because again, the work of art operates imaginatively rather than in the realm of physical existences. What it does is to concentrate and enlarge an immediate experience, just like Kant, Schopenhauer. I suppose Hume would probably say this, although he might not use the same language, that the aesthetic experience is immediate. When we see something that strikes us as beautiful or ugly or interesting or whatever aesthetic quality you want to whatever a quality that you want to attribute to it, this involves a kind of immediacy. It's not a reflection. You're not thinking about it in terms of some sort of concept, right? Like I got this picture here of the infamous fountain from it's a Marcel Duchamp. Someone could argue it's the very first example of what you'll call a found object in art. It's a urinal, right? Turned upside down. So he took something that you would normally urinate in, right, in a bathroom, and he turns it upside down and signs it R. Mutt. There's kind of a story behind this. He wanted to make it anonymous. He was kind of challenging his Dadaist friends who were just, they were tired of like Dewey, they were tired of the snooty art world, and they said anything can be art, and you don't have to be, a part of the tradition, and everything's art. And Duchamp was kind of like, really, everything's art? Let's see if you guys really believe that. And so he anonymously put this as a what's the term? He he entered this for a prize for this committee to be shown at an art exhibit, and they wouldn't accept it, right? And he came out and said, see, you said everything was art, but now you're looking at this urinal turned upside down and you're not thinking. I don't know if Dewey would like Duchamp or his work, but I think it illustrates a bit of a point, right? The urinal, when it was made for a particular function, obviously. It was used for, to piss in, right? And now it's, now that it's been taken out of that context, it's not a part of that sort of world of things where there are public buildings with public restrooms, with stalls, with this and that. It's taken out of that functionality. It's taken out that efficaciousness in relation to other objects. That's the phrase he uses. But it operates, he says, imaginatively rather than in the realm of physical existence. What it does is concentrate and enlarge an immediate experience. The formed matter of aesthetic experience directly expresses, in other words, the meanings that are imaginatively evoked. It does not, like the material brought into new relations in a machine, merely provide means. We talked about means in the last couple lectures, right? It doesn't merely provide means by which purposes over and beyond the existence of the object may be executed, right? So you make a urinal in order to use it, right? But you don't take it out of its context, put it on a pedestal, and throw it in an art museum to use it, right? I guess Duchamp was making a philosophical, artistic statement. Some could argue that the urinal, and he actually did several versions of this, right? You can find them all throughout Europe, and I think even MoMA has a version in New York City. But the original, you could argue that the artwork was actually a performance art. It was a performance piece. It was just him challenging his own buddies, right, who were challenging the art establishment. He was kind of saying, how far are you guys willing to take it? But nevertheless, throughout art history, this approach found objects. You go to museums, you find, what's his name, Rauschenberg with his, that's not Rauschenberg. I always get, who's the guy with all the, he finds car fenders that are all bent up and, puts them up on the wall in art museums and arranges them in a certain way, right? This is, again, working with found objects, things you just find, junk that you arrange. I think Warhol actually did some of that stuff too. Not as much as his sort of, pop art, but I think Warhol worked with found art as well. Not expert on Warhol by any means. But hey, let's back up a bit before I get to this last quote. So again, the formed matter of aesthetic experience expresses in that Deweyan sense, right? It's not a direct emotional outburst, but yet, it's an artist like Duchamp in this case trying to make a point, and he's using this object to make it, right? It's through this medium of the urinal in this case, in which meanings are imaginatively evoked. Really, do we want to challenge the art world as much as we said we did? Is everything art? Maybe we're just as snobby as the people that we're snobs against. Anyway, it does not, like the material brought into relations to the machine, provide a means, right? It's not like something you're going to use again, but again, it's something that is imaginatively operating rather than in the realm of, as he puts it, physical existences. Okay, so why does this pose a challenge for philosophy? This is how he kind of sums up the chapter, this long quote here. This fact, the fact of the uniqueness of aesthetic experience, how it's separate, right? The objects of aesthetic enjoyment are separated. In fact, this is interesting. I know Hannah Arendt in her book, The Philosopher, she doesn't like to be called a philosopher. She prefers political scientist, but it's a philosophical work. She wrote this book called The Human Condition, and she's very much inspired by the work of Martin Heidegger, who we're going to move to next, right after we wrap up Dewey. We're going to look at Heidegger's theory of art. But for Arendt, she says something quite similar. She's a student of Heidegger, and she says, just like Dewey is saying here, art is separate from functionality. These are the only objects that we have now that are made specifically just to be there. just to be enjoyed for just being works of art. They're not being used for anything else, the way a urinal might be used for something else, or a fork or spoon or a knife. Of course, these things can have aesthetic quality. You could go to a restroom and be like, hey, that's a really kind of a cool looking design on that urinal, but you're still going to use it, right? But when we make a work of art, we put it, we appreciate it as something beautiful. It's separate from this, okay? And that's a fact. He says that constitutes the uniqueness of aesthetic experience. And this uniqueness is in turn a challenge to thought. It is particularly a challenge to that systematic thought called philosophy. For aesthetic experience is experience in its integrity. Had not the term pure been so often abused in philosophical literature, had it not been so often employed to suggest that there's something alloyed, impure in the very nature of experience, and to denote something beyond experience, we might say that aesthetic experience is pure experience. So Dewey would like to call aesthetic experience pure experience, but he hesitates because of the history of philosophy and its use of this term pure and impure. You might think of Kant if you watched my Kant lectures, or you've sat through them, and you've taken my class here at University of Houston. Then you know that what Kant means by pure means that it's something that is purely contemplative. It's not mixed by our own emotions and desires, our own personal entanglements. And so it almost takes on a kind of metaphysical tone. What Dewey's saying here, it gives us the impression that it makes nature seem like, makes experience in the raw as something that lacks integrity. And that we have to look for something that is beyond experience. But he says no. This uniqueness of works of art, making them separate and non-functional, it makes it hard for philosophy because it sees things in terms of, it sees experience, pure experience, in terms of something uninterested, unesthetic, right? Contemplative, detached. And Dewey's saying quite the opposite, and again, he hesitates to use the term pure, but he wants to say that in these intense moments of aesthetic enjoyment, this is actually the archetype. This is the example we should look for. This is the blueprint, not a detached, purely contemplative, uninterested. And again, here I think there's a lot of parallels with Heidegger. Heidegger thinks that we need to start with the human as it's actively engaged, as it experiences the world, not as it is contemplating in some study like Descartes sitting by the fireplace thinking about thought, but how are we when we're actually actively engaged? For Dewey, the clue, or one of the best clues, is to look to artistic or aesthetic experience. For it is experience freed from the forces that impede and confuse its development as experience. So that's what makes it pure in his sense, in Dewey's sense. This is why aesthetic experience is, properly understand as experience in its integrity. Again, it's freed from the forces that impede and confuse its development as experience. It's freed, that is, from the factors that subordinate an experience as it is directly had to something beyond itself. So I'm not looking for some way to use this painting. I'm not like, what am I going to do with this painting? How am I going to use it? If I'm trying to think of it that way, I'm going about the wrong way, according to Dewey. Art is not that. That's not its function, right? It's not supposed to do something. I'm not going to walk up with this painting and load that pipe with tobacco and start taking puffs out of it. So to finish his point here, here we have experience in the raw, freed from these factors that subordinate it. In a way, it's detached, but not in a way that's detached like Kant would have us be detached. So aesthetic experience, it's to aesthetic experience that the philosopher must go to understand what experience is. And I don't know if he's right about this, but if he is, then that's a detriment to quite a bit of philosophy, right? If aesthetic experience, in other words, this intense experience of understanding some sort of artistic expression, looking at a painting and seeing the intent behind it, being moved by it emotionally, imaginatively. If those type of experiences are sort of the place where we should start, if that's sort of the blueprint, or not the blueprint's probably the wrong word, if those are the quintessential cases, that's experience proper, and all other experience is sort of a derivative of that. If that's true, and again, I'm not saying it is, but if it's true, then this is a detriment, I would say, to Western philosophy. There are a lot of philosophers, you could argue, who ignore aesthetics, who see aesthetics and philosophy of art as unimportant or as secondary. They focus on metaphysics or epistemology or ethics primarily, and they think that those are the three main foci of philosophy. Aesthetics is sort of nice icing on the cake. Some of it don't even take it serious at all. There's a lot of contemporary analytic philosophers I know that have this attitude towards aesthetic and kind of look down their noses at philosophy of art. And to be honest, when you look at some of the analytic philosophy of art that's out there, there's kind of good reasons for them to think that way. Just sort of my 2 cents. But anyway, again, I'm not saying he's correct about this, but if he is, then philosophy has a lot of catching up to do. And they've got a lot of explaining to do. I do think he's correct, at least as far as he's in agreement with Heidegger, that philosophers traditionally, when they tend to think about human experience, they take as their example, their own experience as a philosopher doing philosophy. And that's a very artificial, special, unique type of mode of experience. Most of us are not in the mode of the philosopher most of the time. We're not sitting here looking at all the objects around us. This is an object. What does it mean to be an object? What separates an object from other objects? I'm a subject, distinct from this object, right? And this is how philosophers traditionally have tended to think. Both John Dewey and I want to say Heidegger, both of them kind of argue against this, that this is a very artificial, kind of stiff. Sure, humans are able to engage in the world in this way, but that's not primarily how we experience things. And for Dewey, he's making this claim that these aesthetic experiences are much more indicative of experience at large than are these intellectual types of experiences, these contemplative types of experiences. Okay, so that's enough, I think, about the chapter on the challenge to philosophy, chapter 12, from Dewey's Art as Experience. Now, in the next video, we're going to try to wrap things up. This video might be a little bit longer than the last few because it's the concluding chapter of this huge epic saga, right? This 15-part video series on Dewey. But let's get started a little bit. I want to read this quote to give you a bit of a preview of what's to come, right? It's the final chapter of the book. I think this kind of brings it all back to the beginning. The first chapter is the live creature, and we and if you watch that video and you kind of followed it, one of the big emphases of that chapter was not just the living creature, but the environment of that living creature, and also civilization as this expression or this underlying what's the proper word, environment, this underlying environment from which art can be created. Okay, so you can't separate art entirely from the civilization in which it was created, right? That's a key point for Dewey. I think that Nietzsche would definitely agree with him on this. They're both sort of on the same page here. Art and civilization are somehow tied together in a way that if you ignore one and try to understand the other, you're going to be missing something. You're going to be missing out on something. Okay, so let me just read this first quote, because he's going to add something here, and he's going to talk a bit about not just art and its relationship to civilization, but art and its relationship to our values, our cultural values, our ethics, our what the Greeks might call our ethos. So let's read this first quote. We'll end on this. The theories that attribute direct moral effect and intent to art fail because they do not take account of the collective civilization that is the context in which works of art are produced and enjoyed. Okay, so understanding that context, understanding the context in which the work of art was created, and in which it was produced and enjoyed by the public, right? You've got to understand that, okay? Otherwise, you're going to make this mistaken assumption, he says, that's a mistaken assumption to attribute some sort of moral intention behind art. Art is just there to express an emotion, an impulse from within. It's not trying to preach to the choir. It's not trying to preach to anybody, right? If it happens to have a moral consequence to it or a moral effect, then that is a result of the beauty of the art, of the effectiveness of the expression, the effectiveness of the artist to get what's in here, right? The juice that's in that grape, to squeeze it through that wine press, right? And to, to provide the public with the new wine, right? The product of art, which is going to be the work of art, if it's effective, right? If it's able to transfer that emotion to the spectator. But that's a mistake. It's a mistake, Dewey's going to argue. We'll get more into this in the next and final video. That it's a mistake to assume that the artist is creating in order to do this, in order to teach us a moral lesson. And if they are, for Dewey, that's not art. So that's what we have to look forward to. This has been a long, drawn-out series. If you stuck around for all of it, good for you. You're much wiser in the ways of John Dewey and his aesthetic theory, and pragmatism in general. I think you kind of probably get a sense of his general view of experience just by looking at his philosophy of art. So this has been a pretty, I think, fruitful effort, I hope. It has been on my part. I feel like I have a better understanding of Dewey after all this, and I hope you do too. Anyways, I'll see you for the last and final concluding chapter, Art and Civilization. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and I will see you on the other side.